Amos was no ordinary prophet. He wasn't a priest or a king's advisor. He was a shepherd and a fig farmer. Yet God chose him to deliver an extraordinary message. Amos became a voice for the voiceless, a champion of the oppressed. His words were a thunderclap in Israel's complacency. He fearlessly proclaimed God's judgment on their greed and exploitation. He spoke truth to power, challenging the status quo. Amos's message was simple yet profound. God cares about how we treat each other. True worship must be accompanied by righteous living. His words remain a timeless reminder that God demands justice for all. Prophets often railed against the sins of neighboring nations, pointing fingers at the wickedness of others. Amos, however, did something different. He dared to turn the mirror inward, confronting the Israelites with their own hypocrisy. He challenged their self-righteousness, their belief that they were somehow exempt from God's judgment, simply because they were God's chosen people. Amos reminded Israel that being God's chosen people wasn't a free pass. It was a responsibility. It meant upholding a higher standard of justice and righteousness. It meant being a light to the nations, a beacon of God's love and compassion. Instead, they had become like the nations around them, consumed by greed, obsessed with wealth, and indifferent to the suffering of the poor. This message is particularly relevant for us today. We too can fall into the trap of self-righteousness, of believing that we are somehow better than others because of our beliefs or affiliations. Amos reminds us that true faith is not about judgment or condemnation, but about humility, self-reflection, and a willingness to confront our own shortcomings. It's about aligning our lives with God's heart for justice and mercy. Amos critiqued empty religion, condemning the Israelites for rituals without true devotion. They offered sacrifices, but neglected justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Their worship was a charade, a way to appease God while continuing in sin. God declared through Amos, "I despise your festivals, take away the noise of your songs. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a stream." True faith is about inward transformation and allowing God's love and justice to flow through us. Section 4. The Peril of Complacency. Amos also warned against the dangers of complacency and pride. He saw that Israel's prosperity had led to a sense of security and self-satisfaction. They had become comfortable in their affluence, blind to the plight of the poor and the injustices around them. Their leaders, instead of being servants of the people, had become corrupt and self-serving, more concerned with maintaining their own power than with seeking the welfare of all. This complacency, Amos warned, would be their downfall. He knew that true strength and security come not from material wealth or military might, but from humility, righteousness, and a dependence on God. He challenged them to turn from their wicked ways, to seek justice, to defend the oppressed, and to walk humbly with their God. His words serve as a sobering warning for us today. We too can become complacent, comfortable in our own bubbles of privilege, oblivious to the suffering and injustices in the world around us. Amos reminds us that true security and lasting peace come not from pursuing our own self-interest, but from aligning ourselves with God's heart for justice and compassion. Section 5. Visions of Judgment and Hope. Amos's prophecies were not limited to words of warning. He also received vivid visions from God, powerful images that illustrated the consequences of Israel's sin and the hope of future restoration. He saw visions of locusts devouring the land, of fire consuming the sanctuary, of a plumb line revealing the crookedness of their ways. These visions were not mere predictions of doom, but calls to repentance, graphic reminders of the urgency of turning back to God. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, Amos offered a glimmer of hope. He spoke of a day when God would restore the fortunes of his people, when justice would flow like a river, and righteousness like a mighty stream. He envisioned a time when the nations would be blessed through Israel, when peace and prosperity would reign. These visions of judgment and hope remind us that God is both just and merciful. He sees our sin and will not let it go unpunished, yet he also longs to forgive, to heal, and to restore. His desire is not to condemn, but to redeem, to draw us back to himself and to fulfill his purposes in and through us. Section 6, a promise of restoration. Despite the severity of Amos's pronouncements of judgment, his message wasn't one of despair. Woven throughout his prophecies were threads of hope, glimpses of a brighter future. He spoke of a time when God would restore the fallen tent of David, a time when justice would prevail and the land would overflow with abundance. This promise of restoration wasn't just for Israel. Amos envisioned a day when all nations would come to know the God of Israel, when swords would be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. This vision pointed towards a future where God's reign of peace and righteousness would extend over all the earth. This message of hope resonates deeply with the Christian understanding of Jesus Christ. We believe that Jesus is the fulfillment of Amos's prophecy, the one who brings true justice and lasting peace. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus broke the power of sin and offered forgiveness and new life to all who would believe. Section 7. Living out Amos's legacy. Centuries after Amos delivered his message, his words still challenge and inspire us. He reminds us that true faith is not passive or private, but active and public. It's about aligning our lives with God's heart for justice, standing up for the oppressed, and being agents of reconciliation and healing in a broken world. Amos's legacy calls us to examine our own lives, to ask ourselves, are we living lives characterized by justice and compassion? Are we using our voices and resources to speak up for those who are marginalized and silenced? Are we actively working to build a more just and equitable society? Let us, like Amos, be voices for the voiceless, champions for the marginalized, and agents of God's shalom in our world. Let us live out our faith with integrity and courage, knowing that true worship is inseparable from righteous living. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. If this message challenged you, let me know in the comments. How is God calling you to live out your faith? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs this truth today.